And good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this sure to be exciting webcast on collection management frameworks, and specifically within industrial control system environments. One moment. So this talk that we're going to be going through, I'll take a few minutes just to introduce this talk and this topic from the perspective of an industrial control system environment, and in my role at SANS within the industrial control system curriculum. And then we'll turn the majority of the talk over to the other two presenters from the Dragos team to talk about some of the things that they have implemented with customers, some different approaches that they've seen work in field and facility environments, and just some of the ways they can help you do better in your operational environments. As I first talked with Mr. Rob Emily about this paper that this group is working on, and we considered this webcast, we had talked about the concept of a collection management framework. And from the perspective of traditional IT environments, so for those that may be joining the call that have recently been assigned duties in industrial control system spaces or responsibilities over some operational environments, as you look to your traditional IT environments and what you may be doing to manage those, you likely already have an established asset inventory of your workstations, your switches, your servers, your laptops, and your access points and other components, firewall devices, that you have a fairly good understanding of what those assets are, what your different device types are, and what data sources or logs or events that are of interest to you, and you're capturing those, and you've probably already gone through some kind of prioritization effort from, in many cases, a business impact analysis or some approach where you would have identified the types of devices that are most important based on some type of criteria. Number of users impacted, revenue loss, reputation, or brand impact if a system goes down or there's some available resource that is not available to your customer set. And from a traditional IT environment, it may seem weird to pull together and kind of have a focus talk on collection management frameworks specific to a new way of thinking, which is truly what the team from Dragos has pulled together. But when you change your scope to more of an operational technology environment and an industrial control system space, and you begin to look at the types of devices that are now need to be looked at, the types of data sources within those devices that need to be gathered, how they need to be prioritized, the different thresholds and different criteria of impact, you're not just looking at the traditional IT environments as in the previous example. You certainly have those devices, and you have traditional host logs, network logs, traffic to do some analysis of, but you also have some additional things that are high priority, like process alarms or operational alarms, various device logs from a wide variety of different types of industrial control system devices, plus the configuration file analysis within those devices, operational sequence of event data that may be important in trying to identify some type of an event of interest, a variety of different communications analysis components, and a number of other secondary systems that could be important in identifying events of interest or events that need some additional instant response. Those systems could include things like work management, change management, ticketing systems, and a variety of other things. So the scope of what you're looking to when you're trying to assemble something similar to what we had talked about in the IT world, but now in the operational technology world, is a much broader scope and definitely not as well defined or understood. And it's why today's talk is so important. As we look to this environment that's changed, again, kind of for those that are on the call that may not have spent their career in industrial control system environments, and they kind of look to these technologies now, and they look to the integration of IT and OT in those spaces, and it seems like it would be a pretty straightforward implementation. Just to give you a scale for why this has been a challenge, I wanted to walk through just briefly here kind of this moving target that we've seen. So kind of in the BC, the before connectivity time frame in the late 80s, early 90s, As you hear the term air gap now, almost everyone kind of immediately goes in their mind to an area, kind of their happy place where they understand there is no such thing as an air gap anymore. But in this BC timeframe in the late 80s, early 90s, this is definitely kind of when the term air gap was believable if you heard it. Definitely limited or no external connectivity into some of these operational environments. Where there was external connectivity, it was generally through non-traditional routable Ethernet-based communications. It was absolutely through kind of serial analog communications, and generally only to non-critical devices. As we move forward in time into the 90s, you started to see these islands of automation appearing throughout different plant and facility environments, as well as a number of different sectors. These islands of automation allowed some level of remote connectivity through analog modems and some very limited Ethernet connectivity for information exchange between systems, but again, truly not from the perspective of absolute command and control or configuration or any of the above. Moving into the 2000s, as this target continued to move, kind of the 2000s to 2005 timeframe, we started to see sort of this enterprise connectivity into these process environments. Ethernet backbone enabled configuration modification, some limited control, and definite use for remote access and remote support. Jumping ahead another time gap from 2005 to 2010, kind of this IT and OT converged state where Ethernet has become the standard. Traditional IP, industrial control system protocols encapsulated in IP for configuration, control, and remote access with the new need and desire for kind of these architected segments. Much of that was learned as we started to go through and connect these in the 2000-2005 timeframe into corporate environments. We started seeing some issue with non-targeted malware moving from enterprise corporate environments down into operational and process environments. With that recognition and acknowledgement of that, moving further to higher connected status, definitely a lot of focus on architecting segments, architecting some level of security enclaves and perimeter control to try to improve the security architecture of these facilities. Moving to the now, kind of this the state that I'll call operations gone wild, where complete interconnectedness, interdependence of networks and systems, and even beyond just that, and into more interconnectedness and interdependence of sectors, with entire sectors and operational environments reliant on other sectors and other operational environments. This has been a consistently moving target for defenders, and we are at a state now where we absolutely need to identify the assets that are of operational importance, gain visibility to those assets, identify what is collectible, and continue to develop some level of operational usefulness. Being able to get and see the data is absolutely a large challenge for many asset owners and operators, but once you have visibility to that data, that really begins to ask the question of what will you do with it and how will it influence your operations in a meaningful way. Just a quick status as well from a tools and from a capability perspective along these same timelines. So kind of in the before connectivity where we were talking analog and serial and some control system loops, definitely if you needed to see that communication stream, you were looking at tapping out from that communication media or using a breakout box so you could actually do some level of analysis. It was absolutely point in time, on site, and generally only done from a troubleshooting perspective. As we moved into the 90s with the limited Ethernet, some proprietary protocols being utilized, and of those proprietary protocols, along with it came proprietary tools with some very large, heavy boxes that would get brought into an environment to get connected in with special connectors, special software, and have some visibility into that communication path. And again, point in time, on site, and only used from a troubleshooting perspective. As we moved into the 2000-2005 timeframe, a lot of asset owners and operators wanted the ability to see the data set directly, but their networking infrastructure generally didn't support the capabilities required to be able to see all that data flow. So they generally had to pick very specific kind of choke points to put an intrusion detection device or some traditional IT asset, so they could look at that traffic from kind of a single choke point perspective. Moving into that next time frame, the 2005 to 2010, is really where the industry started to, the control system vendors started to allow the inclusion of network infrastructure devices that would support switch port spanning and mirroring, and granted full visibility to a lot of the operational data that we never had the ability to see previously. So now we had visibility to the data set, and then the next questions came up of what does it mean? Now that we can see all this communication, we can start to baseline and we can start to see protocols, we could easily identify some things that shouldn't exist, some old protocols that may have been there from previous system upgrades that we could eliminate, systems that were talking to systems that they shouldn't have been, some very obvious things. But after those easy wins were fixed, there was a number of other questions about what do we do next. And that's truly where we've seen this explosion in industrial control system specific tools and platforms, providing us in the industry the ability to now have industrial control system protocol aware tool sets, and providing some level of playbook analysis in regards to identifying a behavior that is potentially suspicious and some actions to take to investigate, or some tools that provide some details in regards to kind of communications whitelisting and identifying these devices had never spoken to each other before, and now they are. Perhaps you should go and investigate further. So with those tools in hand and available to the market, a lot of asset owners and operators have been searching for solutions. A number have been testing or conducting proof of concept tests in test or lab environments, ultimately with the goal of getting to a consolidated view and a consolidated understanding, and looking for a way to operationalize that data in a meaningful way to support the larger operational decisions. So not necessarily operationalizing the data that you can get it all in front of a OT cyber operator who will make a decision, but the next step beyond that, where that OT cyber operator will say, based on what I'm seeing, I'm going to influence some decision making that my system operator or my process automation engineer is going to take. As you look to a number of sectors, the operator in charge of the real-time process, they are taking lots of different data inputs, whether it be system alarms, system failures, weather conditions, temperature, heat, humidity, market conditions, pressure, the various things depending on the system that they're in control of. But they're taking all of those data points and they're trying to consolidate them all into a clear, concise action. Ultimately, this data set will be one of those data points for them to make operational decisions from. So as many look to move to the next step, trying to identify what devices to collect from, how to get that data set, what frequency and what timing, and then what to do with it. That is truly what we're going to cover with the remainder of our time on this call. And with that, I'll be turning this over to Ben Miller, who will take us down the path. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate that introduction. So yeah, I think giving some background of where the collection management framework came from and to explain some of the use cases. So this was Rob Lee and I started talking about this back in 2016 and batting around ideas of just this challenge, right? So you have an operations focus, whether it's a security operations center or what have you, that has some sort of sustained visibility into the environment. And how do you keep up with that visibility and orchestrate it in that way? And so we started in 2017, integrating this into our training program that we have, as well as instilling it into the threat hunting that we would do. So from a threat hunting perspective, when we're doing one of those engagements, the challenging aspect is making sure that you have the data that you need in order to prove out the hunt. We may come up with a scenario such as detecting PowerShell being moved or being involved for lateral movement inside of a OT environment. The challenge there is getting the right data sets in order to prove that out. So it's easy to come up with that hypothesis. It's another to make sure before you agree to go down that path that you will have the data in order to prove it out or not. So that was one of the big scenarios that Dragos ourselves were running into from an engagement perspective that led to a lot of what turned into the collection management framework. But we were also seeing it in our incident response as well. So if we were responding to a incident in a manufacturing site, for instance, the visibility or the lack of visibility and the lack of understanding of the mission for that particular facility was a really important in a challenging sort of way to get in. So being able to walk them through living off the land, quote unquote, which is often attributed to attackers using native tools within the system, but instead using the native data sources that are available at the facility, whether they're traditional IT cybersecurity tools that might be deployed within an OT network or the actual process information that may be available were key from a collection management framework. So ultimately, the collection management framework is, I mean, it's in the name. It's kind of a management tool. It's a framework to give you kind of a new thought process, a new way to define how you may approach these from these concepts from an operational perspective. I would say operational perspective that there may be a team of two that's tasked with defending a facility, or it could be a 24/7 security operations center that is been given new mission as far as monitoring substations or control centers or the manufacturing fleet and how they approach gaining visibility there. So ultimately, the goal is not just creating a one-time solution of what assets do I have and how are they communicating, but to fundamentally be able to perform successful hunts inside their environment, or have high confidence that if there were an intrusion, they would be able to approach that in a meaningful way without hitting bottlenecks. So to give an example of like a use case for collection management framework, we could say be tracking Electrum Activity Group, and they are known to use PowerShell to move laterally between workstations inside of an operations network. So that would be ultimately the requirement that's driving how does that operation gain visibility into detecting and understanding if PowerShell is being used in the environment. The operations team is really using the collection management framework to understand their visibility. Now, the outcome of that is oftentimes recognition of blind spots that they may have on their visibility, which affects the procedures and the playbooks that they have in order to respond to that. Ideally, long-term, that's going to impact how they instrument their security controls and gain heightened visibility in their environment, whether it is something of a traditional data source, such as say firewall or something simplistic like IDS logs, or going to being able to pull device configurations or sequence of events reports, et cetera, from devices in order to start telling a larger story. So ultimately, what this is a tool to help better define higher efficiency and effectiveness from a defensive perspective, if you will. So moving on to the framework itself, we've been working on content around collection management framework now for some time. And we've actually had a fairly solid white paper in draft form for maybe 4 or 5 months now. And the challenge was we had all this material, but it was almost too much material to understand how everything related to each other. We devised and we realized we could use like a Deming cycle, so like the plan, do, check, act sort of cycle, and be able to create the organization that really mapped out the collection management framework itself. So that's what we have today, and we'll actually be diving into each of these phases, and I will cover the first two phases, which is going to I think illustrate where we're going with the collection management framework, and start to track exactly where we're going. So from a develop new requirements standpoint, so if you're not currently using the collection management framework, if you will, you need to define some initial requirements. So from a requirements gathering perspective, it could be really challenging if you have a centralized operation that is monitoring a facility that they do not have a lot of insight or visibility into. So if they do not understand the mission of the facility or the technologies deployed there, quite frankly, there's a lot of research and understanding that needs to happen there. Oftentimes that is seen in tabletop exercises where you explore through how response would work, but also more ideally how response doesn't work within a scenario, so that you can start pinpointing areas for creating visibility within the environment. Oftentimes that's tailored to crown jewel analysis. So crown jewel analysis is really moving the discussion beyond traditional cybersecurity and including the local facilities to understand the industrial process itself, whether that is power generation, manufacturing, oil and gas, and being able to understand how that process works, and then once you understand how that process is working, the underlying devices that are supporting that, and once you understand the underlying devices, then you start understanding how an attacker may be able to have an effect. That goes into threat modeling, right? So once you understand your key devices, being able to model what an attack scenario would look like, and importantly, while understanding the attack sequence that would be taking place, understanding your visibility into that attack sequence. So if in the case of PowerShell being used to gain access to a engineering workstation, for instance, would you have visibility to detect that? And if you do, for going back how many days, and how would you escalate that within your environment? Are all the collection management like kind of key injects of understanding of the facility itself and how that relates to the security? Once you have these lists of requirements and you understand, for instance, a new requirement such as being able to detect PowerShell execution within a supervisory network, that moves into the rest of the cycle, but from a sustained basis. So when you get back to the cycle and you're now into the spot, the next trigger is you've already defined a core set of requirements, but you should have new requirements coming in over time. So whether you are if you've experienced an incident response case, whether it's something fairly benign, such as a near miss that almost happened in your environment, or commodity malware that did make it into an environment, but did not luckily have any impact. That should define some triggers to start this process all over again, so that you can start asking the questions, what more visibility will I have needed to be able to detect this prior to now? And importantly, what do I need from a forensics aspect to not only detect it, but really understand the scope of the incident in a quick and I guess in a very stressful environment, reducing that stress as much as possible, right? Same thing with hunting. So hunting can be quasi-described as like instant response without the incident, right? So you come up with a scenario that you believe is possible, and then you collect the data in order to confirm if that is actually occurring. So I've been using the example of PowerShell, for instance, being able to collect a significant amount of data to then review and see if PowerShell is being used in the environment in a either malicious or non-malicious fashion. But also new intelligence. So as vulnerabilities come out or new attacks or campaigns are being observed, all of those should be triggered events to allow for more introspection by the security operations team on how they map their security visibility to the industrial process and how they would actually defend that on a recurring basis. So all of this is coming up with a list of specific questions or requirements, visibility requirements that are going to drive where we're going. These visibility requirements may be temporary or they may be sustained over time. But the goal here is to be able to articulate the mission of the facility, what's critical with the facility, and then mapping that to the security operations so that security operations both has insight into what that means and be able to begin prioritize and defending those items. So moving from the new requirements to the planning phase. A good example of this would be MS 1710 being propagated and being seen in the wild last year. Really, our goal from a operations security standpoint is to understand and limit our exposure across, say, our fleet of manufacturing sites, for instance. That's well and good. There's a lot of challenges with many OT instances where they're truly relying on SMB connectivity, moving between zones in various ways. Whether it is homegrown processes, those are possibly more easily changeable, versus default or recommended configurations that the vendor is enforcing, where SMB connectivity is required, and then the requisite patching to remove that vulnerability can be a time frame where you need heightened visibility into defending against MS 1710. So from a visibility requirements perspective, what we're really driving into this planning phase is the idea of in this instance, one, visibility into SMB communications between zones. So moving from the corporate or business network into the operations network, as well as visibility into SMB communications internal to, say, a DCS, and being able to understand not just the versioning of SMB communications that's occurring there, but also malicious use of SMB. So with that example, I will kick it over to my cohort, Mark Stacy, to give more illustration of what the collection management framework looks like from an implementation perspective.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. So a couple of use cases. We'll start with probably what is the most common analytic tool to most analysts, and that is a spreadsheet. It's kind of like a default that a lot of people go back to. And so in this case, we've set up a scenario where we have created a very simple CMF, and we've categorized the columns by location. 2 transmission substations, and then kind of a border gateway. And on the left side, 4 rows, we've identified asset type, in this case, kill chain phase, data type, and so on. The important thing to keep in mind is the content is really the focus, not the structure. It may be that the columns are focused on asset type and the location is a row, or vice versa. So I would say focus on what data the defenders need, and how it's organized can be based on whatever the use cases are. But if we start to populate this, as a very simplistic example, we just have 2 assets in our substation A. That's certainly not practical, but for the purpose of this scenario, we'll keep it easy. 1 historian, 1 RTAC device. The kill chain phases can be very useful from a threat hunting perspective, which we'll take a look at in a little more depth later on. But this is useful if I'm looking to create a hypothesis based on the kill chain, or if I want to evaluate my visibility based on the kill chain and map across coverage in that aspect. What's really important is we look at what data is on that device that may be useful in a forensic type effort. So with the first historian being on a Windows device, we may be focused on Windows event log. With an RTAC, we may be focused on alerts or sequence of events or SOE tags, and then where that data is stored. So in this scenario, substation A has been modernized, it's been updated, so we're aggregating all of our Windows event logs to a central server, and we've also deployed an accelerator that is gathering the RTAC devices. Retention is a key aspect here that we'll see in the use cases, and we want to identify what type of threshold and what our data retention is, because that will be very, very useful to responders and threat hunting. And then I added in a documents row here, and I think initially creating a CMF, some of this information may not be available, but I think it's a great goal to have in mind, and that is to provide useful documentation as well and a link to that. So in this case, we have historians. Maybe we've got a manual for what data a historian may house or how to interact with the manual. We've also created a playbook for maybe performing forensics or analyzing an RTAC device. And so we've put a link in here to generate that. Our transmission substation B is a little bit outdated. Imagine we're doing an update scenario, we've made it through one substation, we haven't through the other. So we've got very similar devices, but if we look at the data location, in this case, they are stored local. We haven't started aggregating that point yet. And that probably impacts our attention as well, because we're contingent on local resources rather than aggregation point that we can stick additional storage on. But we've got the same document references there as well. And then we've got a single gateway in this point that both substations would go through the DMZ into the corporate network. And this is where, again, we're aggregating data to an enterprise log server. We've got some retention, and our document, maybe we've got a playbook that's focused on network triage. So I'm going to jump over to, in this case, our log collection server is the Dragos Platform, and we'll use that to talk about a couple of the use cases where this may come into effect. So initially, I think a good practice is to validate what the information is. Retention can certainly change. If I'm aggregating logs to a central server and I update my other transmission and now I'm aggregating these logs to the same server, I'm using more resources, and so my retention may go down. So periodically, I think it's worth it to come into whatever device you happen to be using and to validate that information. So in the tool we're using for this case, I may want to come into my asset inventory. I can filter this based on what the device type is, what network it's on, if I want to validate each substation independently. If I'm focused on, in this case, Windows event logs for my historian, I can exclude external assets and make sure that my asset inventory matches with what I have in my CMF. And then for that data retention aspect, rather than just confirming that yes, it's being in there, I want to go another step forward and look at those specific events, look at the raw data and make sure, A, it's in a format that is useful, B, that I'm ingesting from all of the devices that I should, and again, most importantly, that I've got that retention that I would anticipate to see. Especially during incident response scenarios, if I go to a device and I'm investing the time and the resources to look at those forensic logs and they aren't there, then I've just wasted a lot of time in an action that is very time critical. So with Windows events, we want to come in, we want to make sure that I am getting, again, not just the raw logs, but I have them for as long as I need. So go back to the first log, check the timestamp, and then map that over to whatever your attention should be. If I'm thinking of it from a threat hunting or a incident response perspective, then we'll jump over to our detections pane here. We'll choose a sample alert and work through that. We've got a couple here that look like they're worth our attention. One specifically, we've got a threat behavior here. If I click on that, I see individual detection types, and this is something that needs investigation. It's escalated to the point where we need to dedicate an analyst so we can create a case based on this. We already have one created for us in this case. And using the workflow of the tool, in this case, a Dragos Platform, I may be working through a playbook or just doing triage techniques to investigate that alert. And so using the playbook scenario, one of the first things I'll look at is maybe the external source. And this is where, rather than just jumping into a tool, incident response is a high stress scenario, and so it's easy to jump into the next shiny thing or jump into whatever tools you have available without really confirming or validating the best action forward. And this is where the CMF can validate that for us. If I'm looking for something like an external source, I can come into the raw tool and query those logs to see if I have any hits or triage that specific data. But it's worth it again to come over to the CMF and make sure that I have that appropriate visibility. In this scenario, we have one gateway, but it's certainly practical to say these substations are in different locations, and maybe I've got multiple gateways. And then the same methodology applies. If the second gateway is not aggregating to my enterprise log server, then I could jump over to the tool and I may look through the data and validate that yes, it is, or no, it isn't, but I'm not seeing total visibility of the network. If I'm looking for something else, say one that may include host as well as network data. Well, network data, I may have full visibility of. So our previous example, we have one gateway, I check the enterprise log server, yes, I can see everything. From a host perspective, I have the data in my enterprise log server here, but for my other substation, I have to go local. And it seems very straightforward, but I've run into this personally. We've worked with our clients on this, that when we're responding or when we're threat hunting, we start investigating some alert. And you jump into your security tools that are available and you triage it. But it's worth it to step back and say, am I triaging my entire network? Do I have the visibility that I would expect? Again, in a high stress situation, we have a Dymaloy alert pop up. So we jump into our security tool and we validate it. And we see that, yes, it is a true positive, or no, it's a false positive. And we need to come in and also confirm that the other substation is being triaged as well. So from an incident response perspective, certainly valuable to make sure that you are being consistent and getting a holistic picture. But if we consider other threat scenarios as well, for triage, Ben mentioned MS-17010. If I get an alert that comes out for a specific either incident like MS-17010, That's been out for a while, and so using our instance in this case for the example, the Dragos Platform, if I know what I'm looking for and I know where the alerts are in the tool, I can come down and do a simple check for that data type. But again, I'm not seeing this other network. I may not be seeing all communication if it has a separate dedicated gateway. And so really driving home the point that using security tools is great. Validating security tools is wonderful, but taking one step further and formalizing the collection management, identifying where the data is and what type of retention is there, is useful when you're responding to make sure you see everything. So in this case, we do have some hits, it looks like, for some ransomware, but again, if we don't see that other substation, then we may not see everything. With threat hunting, very similar with the 17010, if you generate another hypothesis as part of your threat hunting program, like a very common one that we generally look for whenever we sit down to a new network is remote access protocols. So I can open up my protocol pane and filter those based on RDP, SSH, VNC, and everything else, and get an idea of what I may have on my network. And that may, assuming I don't see anything from the external network, that may be enough to move on. But again, I'm doing my organization a disservice by not being complete in everything I look at. For incident response, the key with incident response is that it is efficient, it is timely. And this is where I think a CMF really shines, especially with these industrial networks that may have a very large geographical footprint. Say with a windmill farm, for example, or multiple transmission, distribution, generation sites. If I have something happening at one, say I've got a gateway that has been reset or malfunctioning, and I want to confirm those other gateways are operating as expected, I can pull up my content management framework and see maybe 2 TND sites are aggregating, so I can validate those remotely. But these other 2 transmission distribution sites, the data is stored local. So I want to dispatch a resource immediately to go to those 2 sites to manually confirm. In case studies in the past, some of these physical sites may be 3 or 4 or 5 hours away. And so in that case, the sooner I can get someone in a car, the better. Now, if I deployed someone in a car to each site, I'm not using resources efficiently because I can validate some of those remotely. So really just streamlining the process, making sure that my evidence location is understood. And then the retention also plays in when we may be doing host forensics. If I need to investigate some specific historians, and I know that the adversary behavior was last seen 45 days ago, I can use my content management framework to say, well, the retention for this device is only 30 days. So do I want to do host forensics on that? Yes, absolutely. But maybe it's a lower priority because I understand that the activity, from what I can see, stopped before the retention of this began rolling over. So streamlining the incident response process is, again, where I think a content management framework shows some immediate value initially. And I'll pass it back over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Mark. So in summary, I think the challenge is not the detection itself, it's what you do after the fact, right? So if you do not have enough contextual data to be able to assess, is it a false positive, is it true positive, is it maintenance or other expected activities versus malicious activity, that's critical. And using the collection management framework to define your visibility beyond not just your assets and what you're able to detect, but how do you explore that data and do an investigation during a response activity is key here. So as we're developing the collection management framework, essentially the tables that Mark showed and illustrated in the previous slides, that's also going change your environment itself, deploying out new configurations that perhaps are extending out the log retention path from 30 days to 120 days, or tuning out the environment so that centralized logging is occurring in a fashion where you can have greater effectiveness, and that you can get to the data a lot quicker, and creating the automation around that. But also the moving beyond incident response plan. So I think I want to say 100% of the customers we worked with over the last year had an incident response plan. Absolutely. Did they know the next steps beyond that? Were they able to effectively sweep for indicators in their environment, looking for malicious files or behaviors with their environments? Were they able to successfully collect the right data within the OT environment in order to hunt for the adversaries in question? And did they have the playbooks associated with it, moving it beyond the high-level response plan of the owners and roles and responsibilities and communication channels to how do I get access to the configuration file for a particular RTU or PLC? Where are the artifacts within that that's going to tell me when the configuration change last occurred? What confidence do I have in that data? And when I'm accessing that data, what is it changing within that environment that I need to be cognizant of? These are all areas where the collection management framework can be used to grow the procedures from often a tool-based mentality. So that is, after I deploy new tools, I'm going to update my procedures based on those tool sets and change the conversation, instead of a tool-based conversation, into the data. What data sources are in my environment? What can I collect from my environment that's going to allow me a better understanding and an influence of that? In addition, testing that out and really understanding two key questions. What is the coverage that I have in my environment? Or maybe put another way, what blind spots exist in my environment that I need to account for when I am doing detection, when I am doing response, when I am understanding what security architecture and controls I have, but also qualifying it. So beyond just the visibility aspect of I have 100% coverage, how easy and how effective is that coverage? Do you have access to the data in a quick fashion? Is it requiring other teams, other resources, manual steps, on-site steps, as Mark mentioned? And what pieces of those can be automated or streamlined away based on that mission? Your original visibility requirements that we gathered at that first step to help drive how effective it is from a prioritized facilities and how they relate to your business. And then finally, the update step. So we can do the cycle continually on a regular basis, and if we're not pruning our requirements, then what we're going to have is an ever-growing list of requirements, some of which are no longer relevant, and yet you're still executing those. So the final step is really reviewing the visibility requirements that you have generated over time to not just update them based on new requirements, such as, say, a new facility, a new business unit, but also remove requirements as you go through it as well. So in the case of, I mentioned a new facility, it makes sense when you're bringing that new facility online, integrating it with your operations, that you have heightened visibility around that facility for a period of time to understand the risks and make sure there isn't necessarily commodity malware or malicious adversaries within that environment. 2 years later, you may not need that level of detail, that high level of visibility, and it may be more cost effective or efficient to actually lower that by removing those requirements and changing and keeping up to date with how your operations center is executed. So with that is a conclusion of our presentation. I alluded to a white paper earlier. That is not yet published. It is in final stages of a draft right now. And by the end of the month, we will have that posted on our Dragos website. So while I think this webinar is recorded, you can certainly refer back to it, but we'll also have it in white paper form in the coming weeks as well. So with that, I will kick it back over to you, Tim, and go from there.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Mark. We do have a series of questions that have come in. Some of them are more in the comment category, but I'll go through some of those, and then I have some of my own if time allows. But I want to get through some of the attendees' questions first. First is the comment, and Mark, I imagine this is more of a question along some of the material that you covered. I don't know if you want to go navigate to the slides or just talk to them, but it's more along the format of some of the CMF structure, the commentary that you had made in regards to the spreadsheet and the content being what's a value. There's kind of a recommendation or a consideration in regards to additional rows more specific to kind of follow-on collection from the CMF, so things that you would be doing after, more on the system logs, files, and timelines. So that was a comment from an attendee, but I imagine a question that could be pulled from that is the example collection frameworks that you showed in spreadsheet format. I believe those were meant to be as basic as possible. If you can give us an idea of, just the scale and scope and complexity of some that you've seen in use, and to what level of granularity and detail do you typically see live at a customer site?
Yes, so absolutely agree. Follow-on data is an excellent recommendation, and this was simplified, of course, for time and then also the visibility. I would say what we show on the screen here is kind of like a starting point, but there are multiple different points, even if there are specific historian logs that are stored or an application that's installed on top of Windows. In some case, you have application logs in addition to Windows event logs. I think starting simple and then running through, like Ben said, some tabletop exercises, or go through a hunt exercise where you generate a hypothesis, leverage the CMF to see where you would find data to answer that question, and then build on it over time. I believe that the CMF in general should somewhat be a living document. Things are going to change. Your retention is going to change, as I said, when you add new devices in, and you may find additional data that's of value as you confirm what's there. I talked about the Windows source event logs. It could be that in evaluating those, you find, again, some application logs or something else that is stored on the system that is of value. And so you can go update your CMF. So keeping it as a living document, adding rows that are of value and adding data along is certainly useful. I also think in many cases, some people add a row in or an idea and they debate whether or not it is appropriate because it may not have a value for every column you've established. And I think that's okay. The idea isn't to have complete end-to-end coverage and every box filled out. It's making what data is of value to a defender. So if I don't have, say, an RTAC playbook or a manual, that's fine. But it also leverages the opportunity if I'm coming through and looking to increase my coverage, increase my response capability. Pulling the CMF, I can look for where I have those data gaps and also focus on that.
I'll also add on top of what Mark said. So we mentioned like Excel being like the second best security tool out there. If you imagine each facility as a separate tab within that, and expounding in the rows and columns where you have specific hosts or specific data sources, like a host name for your firewall, for instance, or the 2 firewalls that you have within that segment, is that specificity of where you want to get to. If it's not at the host level, then speaking broadly across like a particular zone, or say like a level of the Purdue model, or somewhere along those lines, is going to start getting you on the right path.
All right. I've kind of flowed through all of the questions in chat. There are a number of things that are simply supporting and applauding things we've said on the webinar, so you should both feel good about comments made. One other question that I will ask, and it's probably somebody who is looking at the tool or trying to understand the tool or selecting a tool, and their question was kind of tying 2 things together. So the CMF that was talked about and the Dragos platform that was shown. The question is, does the Dragos platform help to ensure that the collection is flowing as expected? So the collections that you've identified, does the Dragos platform actually help to ensure that you're receiving what you should be receiving?
Yes. So the Dragos platform works in kind of a store and forward fashion, if you will. So the sensors themselves that are deployed in the various networks, if communications were to stop there, it'll store that, and then when the connection to the centralized management system is restored, the logs will be retrieved. And there are measures that we do to, like, say, a drop of communications from one data source, and be able to alert on that. And by data source, I mean not just the sensor itself, but say if a particular syslog feed stops going to the midpoint, that will be discovered and alerted as one of the data sources that could be going to the sensor itself.
All right. I think I've covered the attendee questions, but I've never, ever ended a single webcast early or on time. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that I took notes myself while you were speaking. Mark, to the CMF, kind of again, as the previous questioner had identified, the examples provided are meant to be demonstration purposes. But in actuality, to what level of granularity do you usually recommend going down to, knowing that there are differences in data sources, in data quality, and those differences could get all the way down to specific firmware that's on a device, or where the device is located in the network, and what kind of data it would be able to see versus another similar device in a different part of the network. As you're identifying all those different devices and where they may be in a facility, what granularity level do you go down to in the CMF? Eventually you get to a point where, like attack tree analysis and other things, you're spending untold hours that you may not get a return on. So just as you've done this out in the field, what level of granularity do you get to?
So again, I would focus on what data is of value to the defenders. Of course, starting simple, and then maybe taking an iterative approach to dive into each one, either based on an asset type or a network, and building those out. Unfortunately, I don't have a broad question. It's based in the context of the network, and then again what the defenders need. But from a visibility and gap perspective, I guess I would say I see a lot of organizations that may have money to invest in securing the network or improving their security posture, but without knowing what is on the network, without knowing what forensic data is of value, where the data is, what retention it has, I'm not sure how you prioritize what you need. So starting first and taking an initial approach to say, where are the big gaps now, maybe a good place to start, and then working with the defenders, working with the people responsible for doing forensics, pose a question and see if the CMF can direct them to where the answers to all those questions are. If they can't identify where the answers are located or where the data is stored, then that's another step in detail that you need to strive after. So I hate to talk around the question, but as far as the level of detail, very subjective to the type of environment and what your ultimate goal is.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Tim. Just to expand on that a bit, like I think in some ways what you're describing is the capability. So the capability to identify the devices as well as the firmware revs within there. So that's absolutely. I think that's where a lot of the discussion has been today and kind of ends. So as a capability, the Dragos platform does that and can do that asset discovery. I think the question is beyond that from a collection management framework. What that supports is, okay, now you know where your safety systems are. You've identified those as exceptionally critical systems to the facility. What additional controls do you have in place to understand when a configuration changes on the device or where unknown binaries are sitting on an engineering workstation? Being able to just articulate those questions and then stepping back and figuring out the dependencies there from a operational perspective, not from a tool perspective, but how do we continually monitor for these activities? That's where the collection management framework is fitting into.
That's perfect. And I've successfully gone over time 100% of all webcasts. Carol, we thank you, and we'll turn it back to you.
All right.